You know, many people are talking about a new Cold War. And indeed, the rhetoric we hear from our government and from the Russian government, the arguments and so on, are very reminiscent of the Cold War at its height. But when I think about it, I find some very fundamental differences to the relationship now and the relationship during the period that we now call the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was a worldwide confrontation of the Soviet Union and its allies, some of them forced allies, and the United States and its allies, and much of the battleground was in what we call the Third World, where both sides were competing for influence. It was marked not only by that geopolitical competition, but what lay behind it was a deep ideological fissure. After all, the Soviet Union had been formed as a result of a Bolshevik revolution, a Marxist revolution, with the ostensible goal of leading a world revolution and creating a proletarian state, a socialist state that would evolve into a communist state. So you had a profound difference, and one that applied worldwide. Behind that, we had the developing geopolitical competition of competing alliances, and most dangerously, an absolutely insane arms race. At the height of the Cold War, I think it was calculated that both sides had something like 60,000 nuclear weapons, 40 to 60,000 each, and that this was enough, if used, to destroy civilization on Earth, not once, but maybe 7 times. And one wonders, after you do it once, why do you want to do it again? Obviously, there was, something behind it. Of course, the idea was that we were not going to use these things, but we had to make sure the other side didn't have an advantage, or they might use them against us. We ended that very quickly in historical terms in negotiations over about a 3 or 4 year period in the late 1980s. And looking back, one of the key things that I think that lay behind our ability to negotiate an end to that arms race, and indeed an end to the Cold War itself, was an agreement that few people paid so much attention to, that President Reagan and then General Secretary Gorbachev made in their first meeting in November 1985. And that was the simple statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, which means there can be no war between us. And this allowed our negotiators, notably George Shultz, the Secretary of State at the time, to go to his counterparts, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, and to Gorbachev, and said, look, we're robbing our people in this arms race. Obviously, we're not going to use them. It would be suicide. Why are we doing this? Let's cut them, and let's cut them drastically. And both Gorbachev and the then Foreign Minister Ryzhkov say in their memoirs, this was the most powerful argument. And once they were convinced that we were serious, with great rapidity, we were able to end the arms race and also to negotiate an end to the confrontations, in the process of which Gorbachev officially abandoned the Marxist philosophy which had lay behind the controversy and the whole Cold War. Now, when I today think about our differences, they're simply not comparable. Syria, Actually, the interests of Russia and the interests of the United States in Syria are almost identical, and why we've come to see each other as enemies in that obviously there's a difference of opinion about the tactics, but the basic interest is the same. And the idea that Russia doesn't have a legitimate interest in Syria, I don't know how a person could hold that if they take one look at the map as to where Syria is situated. Of course, and then we're hearing now about Russian belligerence, Russian aggression, and we must begin to bolster our military deployments in Eastern Europe. You know, that, I'm afraid, is going to start us for no good reason at all, because I don't see any Russian threats to Eastern Europe, on another of these insane arms races. And I think one of the things that lies behind the attitudes and what is developed has been the fact that both sides have developed narratives justifying their action, completely different narratives, both of which are wrong. Let's start with the end of the Cold War. Did we win it? Well, yes, but they did too. The fact is, it was not comparable to a victory of one side over the other. We negotiated an end in the interests of everybody, including the Soviet Union. Did the Cold War bring the end of the Soviet Union? No. This Cold War ended at least 2 years before the Soviet Union broke up. The Soviet Union would not have broken up if the Cold War had continued. It broke up from internal pressures, and actually the American government at the time didn't want it to happen. President Bush gave a speech in Kiev, August 1st, 1991, advising the Ukrainians and the other non-Baltic, non-Russian republics to adhere to Gorbachev's Union Treaty. And he also warned against suicidal nationalism. He was then thinking of Georgia, not Ukraine, although one could think of Ukraine today. And he made the important statement, which most people ignored: freedom and independence are not synonymous. Choose freedom. Well, they made a different choice. Not being forced by the West to break up the Soviet Union, but because the elected Russian leader led the others in breaking up the Soviet Union. So actually the Soviet Union broke up after the Cold War ended, and probably would not have broken up if there had been pressure from the outside. Now, from that, however, we suddenly began to say we won the Cold War. And we won it by military pressure and economic pressure on the Soviet Union. Look, they broke up, we won. This means that our pressure can, anytime we want to remove a regime, then all we have to do is to bring sufficient pressure to bear. So then we talked about being the sole superpower, not giving much thought to what it means to be a superpower. We said there used to be two. Well, there were these two countries that could destroy civilization. There's still two countries that can destroy civilization, if that's important. But does that power give you the power to transform other societies? Does that power give you the ability to police the world? No, I think we should have learned after the misadventures in Iraq and Libya that using that power to try to coerce other societies to become normal, peace-loving societies or democratic societies just doesn't work. On the Russian side, and I will conclude with this, they have used the steps that we took based on that misunderstanding of history as directed at them in expanding NATO and walking out of arms control agreements such as the ABM Treaty, in invading other countries against their advice and those of our allies, many of them, as we did in Iraq, step after step, and then seeming to wish to bring in countries that were once part of the Soviet Union into NATO and an alliance against them. So this has become a feeling that the U.S. policy is trying to encircle them, and what we're seeing, and people are calling aggression now, is really a pushback from that. So I think others will discuss many aspects of this, but the attitudes on both sides go back, I believe, to a total misunderstanding of how we ended the Cold War and the significance of that. And some of the things we're doing today risk taking us back over that road that created the Cold War in the first place.